Hi, my name is Carl Torsbins, and this video is titled Anthony Lester. Was his death an accident, suicide, or murder? This is a follow-up video on one of the most highly preventable suicides in the history of the Arizona prisons. And if you're not following, or if you haven't been following the Arizona prison scene, it is currently experiencing a very high rate of suicides and unexplained natural deaths that requires a closer look by those who are in charge of oversight of these prisons, particularly the Department of Justice, or maybe non-profit groups such as the ACLU and other advocacy groups that have an interest in identifying mistreatment or abuses within the happenings of an Arizona prison. His death was called a normal suicide because of the cultural sensitivity level in Arizona, and because of the commonality of death by suicide inside the prisons. They are not given the proper attention from the moment the person is discovered, either by hanging, by self-mutilation, or razor sharp instruments, or any other means that has been documented in the several past years. Anthony Lester was a mentally ill inmate. He was set up for failure, you might say, by the criminal justice system in Arizona, because his mental illness was ignored and not treated by the Department of Corrections. And if you watch Wendy Halloran's Part 1, Part 2, Failure to Render First Aid to a Prisoner, you will see that everything that follows are questions about what really happened in that Tucson prison that day back in July 2010. Suicides in Arizona prisons are a common event. If you want to visit www.azcorrections.gov and look at their news releases identifying a high number of suicides in their agency, you will see that it's unusually high for a small system like this compared to Texas, Florida, or California. We know for sure that the death of Tony was not an accident. From a complete review of the investigative packet provided by the agency, it can be positively identified to rule out that Anthony's death was not an accident. Based on the physical evidence, the facts released and revealed deliberate manufacture of a razor-like weapon to inflict the cuts and wounds that ultimately cost him his life. Anthony Lester's case was determined to be a suicide from the moment his body was discovered, as the officers focused on finding a suicide note rather than life-saving efforts and treating the cell he was assigned to as a crime scene. Again, going back to Wendy Halloran's video investigative report, you will see exactly just how badly this case was handled from the beginning. His cellmate was never treated as a murder suspect and was removed without the usual preservation of evidence by gathering his clothing and other items before he was allowed to wash up and be moved to a safe cell. The brief interrogation by the assigned investigator reveals a lack of effort to treat this as a homicide, and focused on questions that did not add any value to the interview other than verifying the fabrication of the razor. The fact that the inmate went to sleep after he helped Tony fabricate this razor by breaking it open, and that he called for help after he noticed that there was blood dripping on the side of the wall onto his bunk that came from Tony after he cut his throat or his jugular. The investigator was compromised by the short time frame given to him by his supervisors and denied the opportunity to treat this matter with a thorough and effective process that includes processing the written reports, the physical evidence, and the circumstances. Usually when a crime scene or when a inmate death is reported, the first call that is made is to the chain of command, and the chain of command issues the follow-up orders as to how it is to be handled and what kind of time frame and who the players are. It's a very rigid process, and The investigator assigned to this case was pretty much, how do you say, put in a bad spot because of the short time that he was given to get the facts to this case. The investigation was concluded based on the fact that it was a suicide because Tony had a suicide history, and made this case an open and shut matter instead of treating it like a criminal case. Mentally ill inmates in Arizona prisons are automatically at a disadvantage when it comes to their preservation of life, their preservation of rights, and their preservation of whether or not the truth is going to be revealed or not. Because when you go and look at their history, you will see a documented record of prior acts that can, in fact, allow the agency to come to a reasonable conclusion that, well, he's tried suicide attempts in the past. He has X amount of attempts. It looks like he finally successful, and they closed the case based on it being a explainable suicide. Although preventable, they feel they can explain it by the mere history of the prisoner's past. Listening to the audio tapes of the investigator, it was shoddy and without details that indicated a predetermined disposition of this case. The way this case was handled internally was anything but how a certified police officer on the outside would handle the case. The methodology used, the questions asked, the gathering of evidence, and the conclusive attempts to see a three-dimensional crime scene rather than a straight outright suicide case was not there. No efforts were made during the initial moments of this critical incident to determine whether or not the weapon, the cuts, the wounds, and the bruising of the torso in places where it could have indicated a struggle, or at the very least an attempt to resist someone from assaulting Tony before he was cut. If the person attacked is powerless, it offers the assailant an opportunity to simulate a suicidal act based on the prior history and verbal expressions of Tony at the time he gave his cellmate. There was an opportunity for the cellmate to commit a crime or a suicide with design merely on the fact that Tony presented the opportunity and the ability at that moment or during that night. Nobody asked, were the cuts made from the side, the front, or the back? A homicidal attack may take the same direction as a suicidal attack, so were the directions challenged by the coroner or medical examiner at the time of autopsy? Now, this is something that is always questionable, because when the autopsy is conducted, the medical examiner or coroner, what they do is they request case information. And in this case, because Tony was a mental health inmate and because he already established a long history of self-harm and hurting himself, there were no second thoughts or second challenges on whether or not there was a criminal element to his case. Whether determinations made by the coroner whether the cuts were left-handed or right-handed, there's no indication on the autopsy report that that was looked at. Were the cuts or incisions made upward or downward? Were the incisions on the throat prolonged and deeply made, forming a folding of the wound into the soft tissue of the skin? Were the incisions at a sharp angle? Were any ligaments grazed or cut? Did the razor's edge match the perforation of the incisions? Was the razor drawn backwards or forwards? Looking at the sharpness or bluntness of the incision, were they compared to the razor's edge, size, shape, or other peculiarities? The report doesn't show or doesn't state that the weapon that was used was taken to the coroner to make this comparison, and of course at this point in time that's a moot point, because I'm sure because the case is already closed that would be very difficult to determine. Was the witness or the cellmate prepared for this task? You know, just because a person has a suicide history doesn't mean that he or she will actually try to commit suicide. for reasons other than their mental illness. What I mean by that is sometimes, in Tony's case, he knew he was mentally ill, he knew he needed treatment, and he was being ignored for that need to be treated. So what he did was he used his illness to try to use it as an avenue or a tool to get reassigned to another unit where he would get the right treatment. However, his illness was not taken at the seriousness that it required, and he was written off as being gamey and manipulative, thus ignored on the realistic level of being in need for treatment and programming. Was this inmate assigned to do a task? As a probability of him being placed in the cell with another Native American was about 99%. As in Arizona, inmates are housed by race, and the Native American race is a very small percentage of the general population. Should Anthony Lester's body be exhumed for another autopsy and treated as a homicide rather than a culturally imposed suicide that tainted this entire investigation from the beginning? That's impossible. Tony's body was cremated. It was laid to rest by the family's wishes to honor him as the best they could, and the final question will never be answered because there is no possibility for another autopsy. Remember that once a person's body is cremated, the case is pretty much closed, and the family has no other avenues to glean any additional information about their family member's death unless somebody has more information about this case and whether or not anybody talked about it afterwards. That is not a matter of record, but coming forth to give the family additional information showing perhaps it might have been a homicide.